Have you ever wondered what you would do if, overnight, everything you have simply disappeared? Your family, your job, your possessions, everything. It sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? Well, I lived that nightmare. My name is Job, and this is my story. You might have heard of me, but I assure you that my journey is more than just a tale of suffering. It's a life lesson about faith, perseverance, and above all, about what truly matters when everything seems lost. Stay with me and discover how a man who lost everything found the strength to carry on. I was a man blessed in many ways, someone whose life seemed to embody prosperity and peace. My land, Uz, was a fertile and prosperous place, and in it, I built an empire that few could imagine. I owned 7,000 sheep, grazing on the hills, and each of them represented not just wealth, but also God's blessing upon my life. In addition, I owned 3,000 camels, sturdy animals that carried my goods along the trade routes of the East, connecting me with distant lands and their rich markets. My oxen, 500 yoke, plowed the fertile land, ensuring that the harvests were abundant, while 500 donkeys served as a workforce, transporting loads and making life easier on my property. But my material wealth was only part of my life. My greatest joy came from my family. I was the father of 7 sons and 3 daughters, each one a source of pride and unconditional love. They were the light of my eyes, and their happiness was my priority. Their feasts, often held at the house of the eldest, were occasions of celebration and family communion. Although I rejoiced in their joy, my fatherly heart was always vigilant. I knew that even in the most innocent festivities, there was the risk that they might unintentionally offend God in their hearts. Therefore, after each feast, I would rise at dawn to offer sacrifices for each of them, asking God to forgive them for any sin committed, even if unintentionally. My devotion to God was not superficial. It was the foundation of my life. Every act, every decision, was guided by my deep respect and fear of the Creator. I didn't live just to accumulate wealth or enjoy the comfort it provided. My true pursuit was to live a life that pleased God, a life of justice and righteousness. I knew that all the blessings I received, whether material or spiritual, were a direct result of divine grace, and I never failed to express my gratitude for that. In the land of Uz, I was known not only for my prosperity, but mainly for my character, for the way I walked with God. It was this combination of faith and prosperity that made me a unique figure in my land. People respected me not just for what I possessed, but for the man I was. I was a leader, an example of piety and integrity, someone whom others looked up to. I knew that this responsibility was great, but I carried it with joy, confident that I was fulfilling God's purpose for my life. My story up until then was of a man who had found favor in the eyes of God, and I did everything within my power to live in a way worthy of that favor. Looking at everything I had, it was easy to forget that life is unpredictable, that what we have today may not be here tomorrow. However, my faith told me that regardless of what happened, my commitment to God would not change. I lived with the conviction that He was in control, that every event in my life, big or small, was according to His plan. This gave me a security that no earthly wealth could provide. My faith was the anchor that kept my life steady, even when the winds of adversity began to blow. I was Job, a man of wealth and influence, but above all, a man of faith. At that time, I could not have imagined that all of this would be tested in such a brutal way. But as I said, my faith was the foundation upon which my entire life was built, and I was about to discover just how much that foundation could sustain me. On that day, a day that began like any other, I woke up with the sun lighting the hills of the land of Uz. Everything seemed peaceful, and I followed my usual routine, unaware that my life was about to be turned upside down. My children, as usual, were gathered at the house of the eldest, celebrating with joy. While my servants tended to the many responsibilities on my lands, the morning passed quietly, and nothing suggested that disaster was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike its relentless blows. The first sign that something was wrong came quickly, like thunder breaking the silence of a clear sky. One of my servants appeared, breathless and terrified. Even before he could utter a word, my heart already sensed the worst. He told me with a trembling voice that the Sabians, a people known for their cruelty, had attacked. They took my oxen and donkeys and, without any mercy, slaughtered the servants who were working in the fields. That news hit me like a sharp blade. In an instant, I lost a significant part of my wealth, and more painful still, precious lives that were under my care were taken. But there was no time to mourn. The next blow was already on its way. While that servant was still speaking, another one approached, equally pale and haunted. He brought even more terrible news. "The fire of God fell from the heavens," he said, "and burned all your sheep, along with the servants who were tending them." My sheep, which were a fundamental part of my livelihood and a symbol of my prosperity, were reduced to ashes, and more lives were lost. The magnitude of this destruction left me stunned. That fire that came down from the heavens seemed like a direct sentence from God, something I couldn't comprehend. The impact was profound, shaking not only my possessions, but also my perception of the divine order. But before I could process the extent of the devastation, a third messenger arrived, bringing yet another devastating news. The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and attacked your camels. They took them and killed all the servants who were with them. With this, I lost my camels, which were essential for my trade and connection with other lands, and once again, loyal servants were killed. The succession of disasters seemed endless, each new piece of news more crushing than the last. I, who had always been seen as the most prosperous man in the East, was being reduced to nothing in a matter of hours. However, the cruelest blow was still to come. A fourth messenger, with a face heavy with sorrow, brought the news I feared the most. Your sons and daughters were feasting at the house of the eldest brother when a mighty wind came from the desert. This wind struck the 4 corners of the house, and it collapsed on them. They all died. At that moment, I felt my world completely collapse. It wasn't just my possessions that had been destroyed, but the very heart of my life. My children, my greatest joy, were taken from me all at once, in an accident as violent as it was inexplicable. The pain I felt was indescribable. Losing my possessions was one thing, but losing all my children at once was a wound that struck my soul in a way that nothing else could. The wind that blew from the desert and brought down the house where my children were wasn't just a natural phenomenon. To me, it was as if the universe itself had conspired against me, ripping away everything I loved and valued. I felt completely helpless, powerless in the face of the force that had taken my children, with no explanation or reason that I could understand. This series of tragedies left me in a state of deep shock. Everything I had built, everything I loved, was taken from me in a single day. The man I was, with all my faith and devotion, was being tested in a way I could never have predicted. Questions began to arise in my mind. Why would God allow something like this to happen? What had I done to deserve such punishment? As these questions hammered in my mind, one thing was certain. My faith, though shaken, still endured. But I knew that this was only the first part of a much more painful and complex journey that I was about to face. In the face of everything that happened to me, my first reaction was one of deep mourning, a mourning that transcends ordinary suffering. I, Job, the most blessed man in Uz, was now stripped of everything I knew and loved. I tore my clothes as a sign of pain and despair, a gesture that symbolized the complete collapse of my life. Shaving my head was the next step, an act of extreme humility before God, a silent confession that I had nothing left and was nothing more. I was stripped of pride, stripped of everything, standing before the Creator. Even with a broken heart and a mind engulfed in confusion, something inside me refused to give in to complete despair. Instead of cursing the day I was born, as the pain urged me to do, I knelt down and bowed my head to the ground, and with what strength I had left, I worshipped the Lord. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return, I declared, acknowledging that all things, my possessions, my family, my very life, came from God and belonged to Him. Even in the face of indescribable loss, I could not deny the divine sovereignty. This was the choice I made. Even without understanding, I still praised the name of the Lord. My wife, on the other hand, was equally devastated, but her pain led her to question the reason for our integrity. "Do you still maintain your integrity? Curse God and die," she said, her words laden with despair and bitterness. It was understandable. She had lost everything too. However, my response was firm. "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" Even in the darkness of our suffering, I could not accept the idea of renouncing God. To me, integrity was all that remained, and I clung to it with all my strength. It was the only thread that kept me connected to my faith and what I believed to be God's purpose for me. The days that followed were a mix of silence and agony. The wounds on my body, caused by painful sores that covered my skin, were a constant physical reminder of my torment. Sitting among the ashes with a piece of broken pottery in my hand, I scraped my skin in a desperate attempt to relieve the pain. But what hurt most was not my body, but my soul. I felt completely abandoned, not just by God, but by everything that once gave meaning to my life. The questions came incessantly. Why was I, who always sought to be righteous and upright, going through this trial? What was the purpose of all this suffering? As I wrestled with these questions, I began to curse the day of my birth. I questioned why God had allowed me to be born, only to experience such suffering. If the life given to me resulted in such pain, why should it continue? I longed for death, not as an escape, but as a release from the unbearable burden I carried. This anguish was deep, a darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. Yet even in the midst of this despair, my faith, though shaken, still held me to the little that remained of hope. What kept me going was the persistent belief that God was still present, even if invisible and incomprehensible at that moment. I couldn't see the purpose in my suffering, but somehow I knew He was there, watching, and perhaps preparing something that I couldn't yet understand. I continued to struggle with my faith, to question and lament, but never to abandon it. Deep down, even though my spirit was broken, I still believed that somehow there would be an answer, a revelation that would give meaning to all this suffering. It was this small flame of faith that, though flickering, continued to burn within me. When the news of my misfortune spread, my closest friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came from afar to see me. They were wise men, respected in their lands, known for their understanding of God's ways and their ability to counsel the afflicted. When they arrived and saw me from a distance, they could barely recognize me. The sight of the man I had become, sitting in ashes, covered in sores, was shocking. In silence, they tore their clothes and sprinkled dust on their heads, a sign of deep mourning and solidarity with my pain. For 7 days and 7 nights they sat beside me without saying a word, sharing in my suffering merely by their presence. When I finally broke the silence, it was to express the depth of my despair. I cursed the day of my birth, questioning why light had shone on that fateful day. This was the trigger for my friends to begin speaking. Initially, I hoped their words would bring comfort and understanding, but I soon realized that their intentions, although well-meaning, did not grasp the true nature of my anguish. Eliphaz was the first to speak. He suggested that my suffering was the result of some hidden sin, something I must have done to deserve such punishment. His words were harsh. Remember now, whoever perished, being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? To him, suffering was a direct consequence of sin, and he believed that if I repented, God would surely restore my fortune. Bildad followed in the same vein, but with an even harsher tone. He argued that God is just and would never punish an innocent man. He insinuated that if my children died, it was because they had sinned, and that I should accept this truth and seek a more righteous life so that God might bless me again. To Bildad, the justice of God was unquestionable, and any suffering must be deserved. His words, instead of bringing comfort, brought more pain, as they implied that my children had brought their own death upon themselves. It was as if he were turning my grief into guilt, a burden I could not accept. Zophar, the youngest of the 3, was even more direct and relentless. To him, my insistence on defending myself and questioning the justice of God was a sign of arrogance. He rebuked me for trying to justify myself before God and suggested that my punishment was, in fact, less than I deserved. Zophar urged me to humble myself, cleanse my heart, and seek God with sincerity, for according to him, only then could I find peace. His words were like salt on my wounds, aggravating my pain and increasing my confusion. I had hoped my friends would understand my anguish, but all I found were veiled accusations and mistaken assumptions. With each speech from my friends, my frustration grew. I knew deep within myself that I had not committed any sin that would justify such calamity. My life was dedicated to God, and I always sought to live with integrity. What my friends could not understand was that not all suffering is divine punishment. My experience forced me to question their traditional perceptions of justice and retribution, and I began to see that human wisdom has limits. In the end, my pain was not just physical or emotional, it was also spiritual, as I struggled to reconcile the image of a just God with the inexplicable suffering I was enduring. After all the anguish, the unanswered questions, and the endless debates with my friends, what I longed for most was a word from God. I wanted, with all my being, to understand why I was going through so much suffering. I felt that if I could hear God's voice, perhaps I would find some peace, or at least some explanation for the pain that consumed me. And then, in an unexpected and powerful way, God finally spoke. His voice did not come in gentle whispers, but in the midst of a storm, a whirlwind that mirrored the intensity of my own inner turmoil. When God began to speak, it wasn't to directly answer my questions or to justify his treatment of me. Instead, he confronted me with a series of questions about creation, about the universe he had formed, and that I, in my human limitations, could barely comprehend. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" he asked, and each of his questions highlighted my smallness in the face of the vastness of divine power and wisdom. I was led to reflect on the mysteries of the natural world, the stars, the seas, the animals, all elements of the universe that are under God's control but are beyond our full understanding. As God continued to speak, it became clear that the central point of his words was not to justify my suffering, but to emphasize his sovereignty and the complexity of creation. He reminded me that there is an order in the cosmos that goes far beyond human understanding. While I was preoccupied with seeking answers for my suffering, God was calling me to realize that there are greater things at play, that the entire creation is the work of his hands, and just as I was not present to witness the beginning of everything, there is also much I cannot see or understand in my own life. This revelation was both humbling and liberating. I realized that in my pain and confusion, I had tried to reduce God to something I could question and fully understand. But in the face of his words, I was brought to acknowledge that God owes no explanations to man. His wisdom is infinite, and his reasons are often beyond our comprehension. It wasn't about me being punished or rewarded, but about accepting that the creator of the universe was in control, even when I couldn't see the purpose. My role then was not to understand every detail, but to trust in God's goodness and justice, even in the midst of suffering. Finally, in God's presence, all I could do was humble myself. I said, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you?" I put my hand over my mouth. I recognized that I had spoken of things beyond my understanding, things too wonderful for me, and in that recognition, I found a kind of peace. It wasn't the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of knowing that God, in his infinite wisdom and power, was in control. I repented in dust and ashes, not for sins I hadn't committed, but for questioning the justice and wisdom of God. And so, in the midst of the storm, I found a new understanding of my place in the universe and of the greatness of the one who created it. After God spoke to me, something deep inside me changed. I didn't receive all the answers I wanted, but I was led to a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty and my own insignificance in the face of his greatness. In the recognition of my limitation, something surprising happened. God, in his infinite mercy, decided to restore my life. This restoration was not just a compensation for the losses I had suffered, but a demonstration of divine grace and goodness that goes beyond any human understanding. First, God instructed my friends to offer sacrifices and asked that I pray for them. They, who had falsely accused me and spoken wrongly about God, now needed my intercession to be forgiven. This was a moment of great significance for me. Instead of holding a grudge, I was called to forgive and pray for those who had hurt me with their words. This act of intercession not only restored my relationship with my friends, but also was the starting point for the restoration of my own life. Then something even more extraordinary happened. God restored everything I had lost and gave me double. The possessions that had been destroyed, the sheep, the camels, the oxen, and the donkeys, were returned in double measure. Where there had been desolation before, there was now abundance. My lands, which had been plundered and devastated, flourished again, and the prosperity I had known before surrounded me once more, but in an even grander way. Every animal I had counted as lost was replaced by two, and the sign of God's blessing was clearly manifested in every part of my new herd. But the greatest blessing of all was the restoration of my family. God granted me 7 more sons and 3 daughters, as beautiful and precious as those I had lost. Though the pain of losing my first children would never be completely erased, the birth of new lives brought new meaning and renewed joy to my home. My daughters, in particular, were known throughout the land for their beauty, and there were no women as beautiful as they in all the region. This new family became a symbol of God's mercy, a proof that even after the deepest darkness, light can shine again. Over the years, I lived an even fuller life than before. God gave me 140 more years, enough time to see my children and my children's children grow up. The latter part of my life was more blessed than the first, not just in material terms, but also in wisdom and understanding. I came to realize that the true blessing was not just in riches or family, but in intimacy with God and the acceptance of His will, regardless of circumstances. This was the greatest lesson I learned, and I lived the rest of my days in peace, grateful for every moment and every blessing that God, in His infinite grace, decided to bestow upon me. The story of my life is not just a tale of suffering and loss, but a testimony to the transformative power of faith and the grace of God. In passing through the fire of affliction, I was led to question, to struggle, and finally to understand that there are mysteries in life beyond our comprehension, but that God's sovereignty and love remain unshakable. My journey is proof that even in the depths of pain, faith can sustain, restore, and renew, transforming even the most devastating suffering into an experience of spiritual growth and renewal. In the end, it was not just the restoration of my possessions or the granting of a new family that marked my life, but the profound conviction that in all things, God is trustworthy and that His blessings go beyond what we can imagine. My name is Job, and this is my story.